We picture someone who's exceptionally good with money in a very specific way. They're tracking every purchase. They're talking about index funds at dinner. They're driving something sensible and slightly too old. But behavioral economists have found that the most reliable predictors of long-term financial success have almost nothing to do with those surface behaviors. What actually separates people who build real wealth from those who don't is a set of neurological patterns most people never think to look for. And some of them look nothing like financial competence at all. Here is what the research actually reveals about them. The first thing you notice if you spend enough time around people who are genuinely exceptional with money is that they rarely seem to be thinking about it. Not because they're careless, because they've already removed the need to think about it at all. Research from Cornell University found that people who automate their savings and recurring financial decisions accumulate significantly more wealth over time than those who manage the same choices manually. And they report substantially less financial stress in the process. The reason isn't complicated. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function and self-control, has a finite capacity for decision-making. Every choice you make draws from that reserve, whether the choice is significant or trivial. People with exceptional money management skills understand this intuitively, even if they've never heard the term decision fatigue. They remove the decision entirely. The money moves before they see it. The bills pay themselves. The investment contribution clears automatically on the first of the month. Their financial lives run in the background like infrastructure, which means their mental energy stays available for everything else. And unlike a budget you have to maintain, infrastructure doesn't require willpower. It just runs. The core insight isn't that automation is convenient. It's that the brain never gets a chance to argue with itself in the first place. And here's the thing, nobody mentions about this. It doesn't look like discipline from the outside. It looks like indifference. It looks like someone who just doesn't care about money very much, which is exactly what makes it so easy to miss. The second pattern is harder to see and harder to explain. Many people with exceptional money management skills describe their relationship with debt not as a financial concept, but as a physical experience. They'll say things like, "It feels like something sitting on my chest," or "I genuinely cannot sleep until it's gone." This isn't purely metaphor. Studies using functional MRI scans have found that for certain individuals, the neural regions associated with threat detection and physical pain show measurable activation in response to financial obligation. The brain isn't processing debt abstractly. It's registering it the way it registers danger. Neuroscientists studying this response have found it often develops in what psychologists call high-contingency environments. Situations, usually in childhood, where actions had direct and immediate consequences. Families where money was genuinely scarce, circumstances where owing something to someone wasn't a financial abstraction. It was a concrete pressure with visible effects on daily life. There was no safety margin, no cushion to absorb a miscalculation. Debt wasn't a theoretical problem for future optimization. It was a daily fact with immediate consequences that everyone in the household felt. The brain learned early that liability meant real risk, and it encoded that lesson at a level below conscious recall. Now, here's what nobody tells you about this particular trait. It's not comfortable to carry. It doesn't feel like financial mastery. It feels like low-grade anxiety that never fully switches off, even when the situation no longer warrants it. The debt gets cleared because the brain demands it, not because the person has calmly weighed their options and chosen the optimal strategy. That distinction matters because it means this isn't a mindset you simply adopt. It's a sensitivity the nervous system developed in response to lived experience. The behavior looks like prudence. The internal experience often feels considerably closer to relief-seeking. The third pattern is the one that most visibly separates these people from everyone else in ordinary daily life. They don't experience prices the way most people do. A price tag isn't a number to them. It's a calculation that runs automatically, almost involuntarily, before any conscious decision has been made. A $180 dinner becomes roughly 6 hours of work. A $400 weekend trip becomes a measurable percentage of the month's income. They're not sitting down to do this math. Their brain performs the conversion before the transaction is even considered. Research published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology found that people who naturally frame spending in units of labor time or income percentage make significantly more conservative financial decisions than those who process the same amounts in raw dollar terms. The mechanism is fairly direct. Converting a purchase into hours worked engages a different neural pathway than simply seeing a price tag. The emotional pull of wanting something, I want those shoes, that dinner looks worth it, this version is only slightly more expensive, gets interrupted by a calculation that carries no emotional charge at all. Is this worth a day and a half of my life? That question doesn't land the same way as, is this worth $240? And here's what makes this genuinely strange to live with. For people wired this way, the calculation isn't a technique they apply. It's an intrusion. It arrives without invitation. They're looking at a menu and the numbers are already converting before they've decided what they want. They're in a conversation about a vacation and the percentages are already running in the background. It's not something they chose to do. The calculation doesn't pause when income rises. It doesn't quiet down when the savings account looks healthy. It just keeps on running, a persistent friction around spending that never fully disappears regardless of what the actual numbers say. What connects these three patterns? The automation instinct, the visceral debt sensitivity, the involuntary cost conversion, is that none of them are techniques. They're not the output of reading the right personal finance books or following the right system after a financial wake-up call. They're expressions of how a particular kind of brain already processes time, risk, and resource. And that matters because it means the visible behaviors these people display are downstream effects. The automated accounts, the clear debt, the careful daily spending, those are outputs. What's actually driving them is operating at a level most people never think to examine, which is exactly where this gets more complicated. Here's where the neuroscience gets genuinely strange. Most people's brains are wired to release dopamine in anticipation of acquiring something. The wanting, the browsing, the moment you add it to the cart, that's where the reward circuit fires. The thing itself is often a disappointment by comparison. The neurological peak is the pursuit, not the possession. But a 2018 study from the University of Pennsylvania used brain imaging to examine financial decision-making and found something that complicates that picture considerably. For certain individuals, measurable reward center activation occurs not when they spend, but when they watch their account balance increase, even small increases, even incremental ones. Their brain is genuinely giving them the same signal that other brains reserve for acquisition. The accumulation is the reward. This sounds like an obvious advantage, and in purely financial terms, it is. But here's what that actually means for how these people move through ordinary life. Spending doesn't feel good to them. Not just impulsive spending. Not just unnecessary spending. Spending in general carries a faint but persistent signal of loss. They know intellectually that the transaction is reasonable. They know they can afford it. They know the thing they're buying has real value. And still the brain registers the outflow as a subtraction from something that felt good, which means the pleasure of the purchase has to overcome a baseline resistance that most people simply don't have. They're not being disciplined when they hesitate at the register. Their reward chemistry is running in the opposite direction from the transaction in front of them. The dopamine hit from buying something fades within hours, sometimes minutes. The satisfaction of watching a number grow doesn't fade in the same way. Compound interest working quietly in the background produces a low, steady, renewable signal that spending can't replicate. Whether that's a gift or a limitation depends entirely on how you want to live your life. But it is, without question, a different neurological experience than most people are having. The next pattern involves time, and specifically how real the future feels. Psychologists studying financial decision-making have long used the concept of delay discounting to describe how people value future rewards relative to present ones. most brains apply a steep discount. $100 today feels significantly more valuable than $100 in 2 years, even before you account for inflation or interest. The future is abstract. The present is immediate and certain. The brain naturally weights them accordingly. People with exceptional money management skills tend to have unusually flat discounting curves. Future money feels almost as real as present money. Future consequences feel almost as concrete as present ones. Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab demonstrated this effect by having participants interact with aged digital avatars of themselves, and found that this single intervention significantly shifted saving behavior. But some people carry this connection without any intervention at all. When they imagine themselves at 65, that person isn't an abstraction. They have a voice. They have preferences. They have a claim on decisions being made right now. And here's the thing. That future person shows up uninvited. When the present version of them is weighing a purchase, or considering a risk, or thinking about changing jobs, the future version is already in the room, already registered an opinion, already made the present choice feel like something that has to be answered for. That's a remarkable form of internal accountability. It's also, if you sit with it honestly, a form of self-pressure that never fully turns off. The future self who will benefit from today's good decisions is also the future self who will suffer from today's bad ones. That person feels real enough to create genuine anticipatory guilt, which means the person who has this trait is never entirely free from a sense of obligation to someone who doesn't exist yet. The sixth pattern is related, and it runs quietly enough that most people who have it don't realize it's doing anything. Psychologists call it effective forecasting, the ability to predict your own emotional responses to future events with reasonable accuracy. Most people are surprisingly bad at it. They overestimate how much a good thing will improve how they feel, and underestimate how quickly they'll adapt to a bad one. But people with strong, effective forecasting in financial contexts run a different simulation. They imagine buying the thing, getting home, and feel the texture of that experience in advance, not vaguely. Specifically, a 2017 study from Princeton found that individuals with this capacity in financial situations made substantially fewer impulsive purchases and reported higher long-term financial satisfaction than those without it. What this means in practice is that the brake on impulsive spending isn't willpower, it's preview. The regret arrives before the transaction. The feeling of having made a poor decision fires while they're still standing in the store, still holding the thing, still technically in a position to put it back. That's not discipline in any conventional sense. It's an accurate emotional simulation running faster than the desire can act on itself. The desire doesn't win because the aftermath is already visible. Here is where the picture starts to turn. Because so far, everything described sounds like a set of advantages. Automated systems, visceral debt avoidance, involuntary cost conversion, accumulation-driven reward, vivid future self-connection, preemptive regret. These are traits that produce financial security. They are also, looked at from a different angle, a set of traits that make ordinary life harder. And the next pattern makes that cost impossible to ignore. Many people with exceptional money management skills carry detailed, rehearsed mental scenarios of financial catastrophe, job loss, medical emergency, market collapse, sudden income disruption. They've walked through these scenarios so many times in such specific terms that the grief of those situations has already been processed in advance. Psychologists call this defensive pessimism, setting low expectations and mentally rehearsing potential failures as a preparation strategy. Research from Wellesley College found that defensive pessimists perform better in genuinely uncertain situations because the anxiety has already been metabolized. They've done the emotional work before the crisis arrives, so when it does arrive, they're not paralyzed. They've already figured out how they'd survive. The emergency fund exists because they've already imagined needing it. The diversified income stream exists because they've already felt, in some anticipatory way, what it's like to lose the primary one. The conservative leverage exists because they've already mentally lived through the scenario where that leverage collapses. The preparation is the output. The persistent low-level dread is the engine. And that is the cost that almost never gets named. Because so far, everything described has been framed as a pattern that produces results. And it does. But the last trait in this particular constellation is the one that reveals what those results actually cost on a personal level, day to day, in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon, when there is nothing wrong and no reason to feel bad. People with exceptional money management skills often genuinely struggle to spend money on themselves. Not on emergencies, not on obligations, on themselves. The vacation they can clearly afford, the dinner that is well within reason, the upgrade they've earned by any rational measure. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Economic Psychology found that individuals with high savings rates experience measurably more guilt around discretionary spending than those who save less, even when their financial position is objectively secure. Even when the number in the account is large, the guilt fires anyway. What's happening isn't complicated, but it's worth saying plainly. The brain has been trained over years or decades to associate spending with loss, with choosing the present over the future, with breaking a promise to the person they're trying to become. That training doesn't come with an off switch. It doesn't recognize the difference between an impulsive bad decision and a deliberate, well-considered, fully funded, enjoyable expenditure. Both produce the same signal. The discipline that built the security also built the inability to feel secure inside it. That's not a side effect. That's the cost of the system. Now, let's talk about what this actually means. Because here's the thing. When you look at all of these patterns together, the automation instinct, the physical debt response, the involuntary cost conversion, the accumulation-driven dopamine, the vivid future self, the preemptive regret, the catastrophe rehearsal, the spending guilt, they don't form a picture of someone who has mastered money. They form a picture of a nervous system that organized itself around scarcity, risk, and future threat, and happens to produce financial security as a byproduct. Some of that wiring came from early experience. Some of it is simply how the brain waited time from the beginning. The underlying mechanism is what researchers call delay discounting, the rate at which the brain reduces the perceived value of future rewards. Most brains discount steeply. $1 today feels worth substantially more than $1 in 10 years, in ways that have nothing to do with rational calculation. But people with exceptional money management skills have flatter discounting curves. Future money feels nearly as real as present money. Future consequences register nearly as concretely as present ones. That's not a virtue they cultivated. It's a feature of how the brain processes time, and it changes everything downstream. Here is where the picture has to be completed honestly. The person who doesn't have these traits, who spends freely, who lives fully in the present, whose future self feels genuinely too distant to factor into today's dinner choice, is not broken, not undisciplined, not failing at some test they should be passing. Their brain weights the present heavily because the present is vivid and the future is genuinely uncertain. That's a rational response to the actual structure of reality. They're probably enjoying more of their life right now. They're probably less anxious on an ordinary Tuesday. They're probably more present with the people around them because they're not running a background process of financial threat assessment at all times. Neither approach is objectively superior. They're different neurological responses to the same fundamental uncertainty about what comes next. And here's what research from the University of California actually shows about all of this. Life satisfaction increases with income up to a point, and then it plateaus. The psychological patterns that reliably produce wealth also reliably produce anxiety. The discipline that builds security also builds rigidity. There is no version of this that comes without a trade. You are always exchanging something. The question is whether you know what you're exchanging and whether you'd make that trade again if you understood it clearly. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, the automatic calculation, the debt sensitivity, the guilt at the register, you're probably going to be financially secure. That's real, and it matters. Just remember that the security was supposed to be in service of something. Your future self will be grateful for the preparation. That future self is also going to need permission to actually use what you built. Don't sacrifice the present version of yourself entirely to a person who doesn't exist yet. And if these patterns feel foreign, if saving feels like fighting yourself, if the future feels too abstract to motivate anything, if money management genuinely feels like pushing water uphill, that's information, not judgment. You can build external systems that produce similar outcomes without requiring your brain to be wired differently. Automatic transfers that move before you see the money. Friction added to spending decisions. Rules that remove the choice entirely. The architecture can be constructed even when the natural inclination isn't there. You don't need the anxiety. You need the systems that the anxiety was producing. The real question isn't whether you have these traits. It's whether you understand what your brain is actually doing with money, time, and future reward, and whether you're working with that reality or against it. Because that understanding, more than any specific habit or technique, is what actually changes the outcome. If this resonated, if you found yourself in any of these patterns, or finally understood why someone you know behaves the way they do, drop a comment. For more on the psychology behind financial behavior and why we do what we do with money, subscribe. Understanding how your brain works isn't about judgment. It's about finally having accurate information to work with.